Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar for MLE International. We've been having monthly webinars since January, and they all relate to language and education policy towards using non-dominant languages in a wider way through multilingual programs. So I'm Carol Benson. I'm the founder and co-director of MLE International. Irina Iwasaki is our co-director. She's away today conducting a teacher training, can't be with us. But we're very happy to have Kelsey Woodrick here with us. She's a longtime supporter of Emily International, and I'll just have her introduce herself so you know her.
Thank you, Carol. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. As Carol mentioned, my name is Kelsey Woodrick. I'm a volunteer with MLE International and an advocate for bi and multilingual learning. I have worked across Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean, advocating for MLE education. And so I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks. Probably you know that MLE International is a network of scholars and practitioners. We're involved in research and providing technical assistance and support to implementers of multilingual education, mostly in low and middle income countries. And just before we begin, I'd like to share that Kimmo Kosonen and I co-edited a third volume of Language Issues in Comparative Education. It just came out. We're looking at change toward using non-dominant languages, change from above, change from below, and change from the side, looking at different trajectories to examine language policy change. And we have contributors from a lot of our colleagues, a lot of people who come to these webinars. It's open access. So I'll put the link in the chat. And thank you from Kimo and I to all of our contributors, many who participate in all of these discussions about how change happens in languages in education. So today we're very pleased to have with us two colleagues and friends, Polisa Guzula and Carolyn McKinney, both from the University of Cape Town. And they will tell you a little bit about a lot about what they're doing in the area of bi and multilingual education in South Africa. So just before they begin, Kelsey's going to give some guidelines for today's webinar.
Yes, and welcome to those who just joined us. We're so glad that you are here today. And just a quick reminder that we will have 45 minutes for the presentation. And then following that, we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion and reflection. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please add those to the chat and I will monitor those and make sure that we address them in the Q&A.
So without further ado, welcome, Polly and Carolyn, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. We are really excited to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, MLE Carolyn Benson. My name is Polisa Guzula, and I work at the University of Cape Town, working on multilingual education and literacies. And I work with my colleague here, Carolyn McKinney.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having us, Carol and Kelsey. It's great to be here. Claudia and I are giggling because what we could see in the audience are all the South African people that we know. So some of them are our students, and so they will can jump in and correct us where we've gone wrong or where they disagree with the version that we are going to give you today. So we've titled our talk Implementing Mother Tongue Based Bilingual Education in South Africa in the context of ideological and resource constraints. So what we want to do in this presentation is to give you a bit of background on language and education policy in South Africa, how it has been, and what the recent changes are, and then what is happening with how those changes are being implemented at the moment. And then running alongside that, we're also going to tell you a bit about our work in the Boerlit Language and Literacy Collective. So both Polly and I are based in the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. It's a small department, it's not a faculty, and we are 3 in our stream of language and literacy studies. And then we started the Boerlit Language and Literacy Collective in 2018.
Yes.
2018. And these are the women that are part of, these are our colleagues and friends that are part of the Boerlit Language and Literacy Collective. If you want to know more about it, there is the URL that you can hop onto. And basically, we are a collective, as these are little grabs from our homepage of researchers, activists, educators, teacher educators, and so on, who are advocating for multilingual language and literacy education in South Africa. We called it Boerlit, Boer as paying homage to Prace's National Language Project. Actually, the National Language Project, I think, was even before Prace. Before Prace. And they called the newsletter Boer, which means to speak out, Sesotho or Setswana. And then lit for on fire, and things are being lit, and for literacy. So we were feeling at the time that with the passing of Neville and various other things that were happening with curriculum change and so on, that there was not very much voice advocating for bi and multilingual education. And we felt strongly that if we didn't actually start advocating, we would just continue with lack of implementation for a long time. And so really that's what we've been working on. And yeah, that's, I didn't, what was that?
Click.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, now I need to try and move you guys off the screen. Okay, so without saying more about that, let me take you straight into the language and education policy context in South Africa. So we became a democracy in 1994, and in 1996 our constitution was ratified, and our constitution recognized 11 official languages, including 9 African indigenous languages, and the right of children to receive education in an official language of their choice, with the practicability clause, so where reasonably possible or where practicably possible. Then following on from that, the 1997 Language in Education policy was launched, and it was a lot of articles have been written about the language policy in South Africa, the way that it embraces multilingualism as being a norm and an aspiration as well in South African education. But if we look at that policy document, we can already start to see some of the difficulties around how bilingual education was not actually being implemented post-97, because what it stated, and you'll see on the one side I've got here the 97 Language in Education Policy Norms and Standards, and it said that for grade 1 and 2 children, they needed to take one language, which would be their home language of learning and teaching as well, and then they would be introduced to an additional language in grade 3. There was a language requirement that they only pass one language up to grade 9, 2 languages in grade 10 and 12, that the choice of the language in learning and teaching should be made by parents on behalf of the children at the point of application to a school, and the school governing bodies of each school were the ones who were going to draw up the language policy for each school. There was no formal requirement to learn an indigenous African language. So with this policy, you could continue having English as a main language, learning Afrikaans as an additional language all the way through, that would be exactly continuous with apartheid language and education policy. You could also be in a historically black school where you would have had an African language in grade 1, 2, and 3, and then switched over to English as the language of instruction from grade 4. And there was nothing in the policy that prohibited that. So in fact, I've had, quite a few disagreements with many times on people's slides, even a PhD candidate's thesis saying, and the language policy then says that children must have 3 years and then switch in grade 4. There is nowhere in the language policy where it says that, but it is so strongly embedded in people's imaginaries and what's norm that they think that actually the policy, does say that. Right, so in 97, we also had the curriculum, the first new post-apartheid curriculum that was launched, and that took a lot of attention, and there was no attention paid to the launch of the language and education policy. The other problem was that they were not planned simultaneously. So curriculum was developed on one side and language policy on the other, which does sound crazy because you cannot do any content without a language of instruction, but that is, what happened. Then in 2010, we had a new curriculum called the Curriculum and Assessment Policy Statements, or the CAPS, which is what you can see the acronym of in the slide. And I like to call it changing language policy through the back door, because effectively that is what the CAPS document did. Because if you look at the requirements there was no official policy change, but the norms and standards for promotion requirements for children from one grade to the next changed. And in that document, it said children had to study 2 languages from grade 1 to 3. The idea was to introduce English in grade 1 so that they would have more exposure to English before what? Before the changeover in grade 4. So we had a massive curriculum review process, big changes to curriculum, lots of consultation, and language was completely absent from that review process and those discussions. So what happened was then English was introduced from grade 1, and children then have to pass 2 languages from grade 1 to grade 12. But again, no requirement to learn an indigenous African language. So what we can see is that with the introduction of CAPS and these promotion requirements was a further marginalization of indigenous African languages and a strengthening of English in the curriculum, because it now started at grade 1. In fact, it starts now at grade R, the year before that. Okay, so that to take me quite a bit of time, but I think it's important to understand the background we're coming from. At the same time, in that 1997 Language in Education policy document, we have this statement: in determining the language policy of the school, the governing body must stipulate how the school will promote multilingualism through using more than one language of learning and teaching, or by offering additional languages as subjects, or special immersion or language maintenance programs. So as in Boer Lit, we've used the statement, we've translated it to different languages, we've got it on a postcard back to back, and we use this with our teachers to say, yes, you can use children's languages, you can code switch and trans language, because the policy says this. Actually, you've always been allowed to do it, but people don't know that. So in fact, what we're actually going to talk about with the implementation of mother tongue-based bilingual education is not necessarily a policy change. It's a change in implementation of the original policy, where it's actually being implemented, that you can use more than one language of learning and teaching. So despite this, for many years, what we've had is that bilingual education, where 2 languages of learning and teaching are used in the same classroom, has only been available in Afrikaans and English to Afrikaans and English speakers, as it was during apartheid. And that continues to be. Matric the exit exams are still available in those 2 languages. All African language speaking children switch to monolingual English from grade 4. And many of the historically white schools continue to offer only English and Afrikaans as subjects. So just to give you a summary of the situation, we have less than 10% of South Africans that have English as their home language. 7% of learners speak English at home, and 81% have English as the language of learning and teaching from grade 4. So there is this massive mismatch. At the same time, all the textbook materials and assessments from grade 4 upwards have been available only in English or Afrikaans. And yet, children who follow an English home language curriculum and have been immersed in English since birth follow exactly the same content, subject, curriculum as the children who are learning through English as an additional language. So what we can say is that this is really a model of subtractive bilingualism, because the child's home language, after 3 years of using it fully, is then reduced to only learning an African language as a subject, and it is not then strengthened and built in the way that additive bilingualism imagined, where you actually take what children come with and you build, on from that. So the classrooms in reality, to cope with this situation, are like many other classrooms in post-colonial contexts where ex-colonial languages dominate, but children come from a range of other language backgrounds, which is that they are unofficially bi or multilingual, because teachers have to mediate the English-only materials, the English-only assessments, and so they have to use broader language resources in order to do that. So some of our work has been about why we're in this situation. It's more than 30 years. It's 30 years since the language policy came into place. It's more than 30 years since we reached a democracy. And why is it that African languages continue to be so deeply marginalized in our curriculum and in our education contexts? And so this has taken us to work in what we call language ideologies in education. And I think sometimes, people would talk about people's language beliefs or their language attitudes and attitude surveys and so on. And we prefer ideologies because we want to emphasize that these are not just individual beliefs, and they are not attitudes people take up by choice necessarily. These are deeply, deeply held systemic, structural belief systems that shape what resources are available, shape the choices that are available to people, that make what should be normal seem completely unimaginable. So they are much, much deeper structural sets of beliefs, if you like, than just what one might call beliefs or attitudes. And what we find there is that not just in South Africa, this is actually very common in many education systems, is that monoglossic language ideologies, which expect that the normal child, the typical child, is monolingual, those are the ones that dominate. And alongside that, there are all sorts of expectations which are set up, that ideas like legitimate language use is pure, it's standardized, and it's monolingual. We shouldn't use more than one language in a text or in a classroom at the same time. It will confuse children. Multilingualism causes problems for development, problems for moving through the system, and that each child has one single pure mother tongue. So, all of us who work in this field know that none of these are true, that we have many examples of children who've got parents from different language backgrounds. We all move across different varieties as well. A second important one is this idea of African languages as actually being inferior, as not having the terminology, the capacity to work with science and with complex conceptual concepts, and so that they don't belong in education, that they are not carriers of real knowledge. And then I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the other is also around the idea of, well, how did the official languages in South Africa come into being? And this is also, quite difficult, controversial, but the recognition through work of historical sociolinguistics of missionary invented languages. So why, for example, is the isiZulu I written as Ngi, N-G-I, and the isiXhosa as Ndi, N-D-I? Is that really a difference, or was that actually a difference of orthography that happened when an additional language hearer, the missionaries, wrote those languages down? Which varieties were chosen to be the standard? What stands for isiXhosa is actually a whole lot more heteroglossia and variation, but it is constructed. And basically, the 9 official African languages are the ones that were taken from the Bantustans during apartheid, where there was an ethnic division of people according to language. So, and that was done, without any change, I think, because it was such a rushed process, actually, in the end with the Constitution. And then another is this idea then, as I was saying, about how deeply held these beliefs are, is the idea that of Anglo-normativity, that it becomes so normal that children are expected to do everything in English, that people in the workplace are expected to do that, that people must just be proficient in English, that it's almost like compulsory heterosexuality is, so this is drawing from heteronormativity. But also drawing from Ngugi's work on turning the abnormal into the normal, that you don't even question it anymore. You expect that people should be proficient in English, and if they're not, that they're actually deficient or deviant, and that they create a problem for the schooling system. So you look at what children don't have and not at what they do have. It's a very much a deficit positioning. Just to elaborate, because I think that he does it so well, is the Ngugi's explanation of how, in Decolonizing the Mind, his book, of how deeply ingrained the ideologies, these language ideologies have become, which diminish African languages and hyper-evaluate English. When he says, in my view, language was the most important vehicle through which that colonial power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. The bullet was the means of the physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. And as he argues, is that when you get people to internalize a particular belief, then you actually don't need to rule over them anymore, because in fact, they internalize it and rule themselves according to ideologies that are not their own. Right, so that's the picture of what was, where we have been, and of course these ideologies are still with us, right? So that's going to be part of the story as well as we continue. But after this, here comes the Department of Basic Education's circular at the end of 2024. So by this time, Xoli and I and some of our Boerlit colleagues had been up and down to Pretoria for a few Department of Basic Education conferences and policy dialogues, which were moving, spearheaded by Dr. Naledi Mbude Mehane, who was appointed as the Director General of Transformation Projects in the National Department. And by the end of 2024, we had the statement coming out. We can see the minister has endorsed the implementation of the mother tongue-based bilingual education as one of the priorities of the Department of Basic Education. Implementation in number 2 of MTBBE in mathematics and natural science and technology is scheduled in grade 4 for January 2025. And then they also, in the same circular, include this interesting statement about translanguaging. So that's what we've reproduced here. As part of the introduction of MTBBE, the DBE encourages teachers to implement translanguaging across all grades. Translanguaging is a practice of alternating between languages in a bilingual or multilingual classroom to ensure effective mediation of the learning content. Assessment should reflect the languages used for teaching and learning. So in the earlier some of the DBE conferences, what we had been arguing is that if we do nothing else, could the department please put out a statement that just says teachers can translanguage? Because we'd been working in an intervention project where we were encouraging them to work bilingually, and they were being told by the district officers that actually they shouldn't be doing this. And so we were saying, please, could you just legitimize what is already allowed? So that's very, very exciting for us to see not only the MTBBE introduction, but also the embracing of the translanguaging practices which our teachers have been really creative in using in order to survive in the current system. Okay. So this, for us, also mother tongue is a tricky term. It's problematized sociolinguistically. We certainly problematize it when we teach, our postgraduate courses. But this is one of those moments where we had to just suck it up and accept the terminology, because we didn't want to undermine the importance of bringing African languages and children's languages into the classroom. So Boylet set out on a public education kind of, I wouldn't say campaign, but, project, and Claudia will show a bit more of it later, but we developed pamphlets in all the official languages, one which is what is bilingual education, another which is what is MTBBE, another one on how to develop a school language policy. The school language policy one, Carol, actually is almost identical to the one that Pricer developed several years ago, that particular one. It's living on. So in the mother tongue, in the bilingual education one, we expose that there are different kinds of bilingual education. So up in the top right corner, you can see we talk about mother tongue based dual medium education, parallel medium, which isn't really bilingual education in our view, but it's one of the ones people get told about, and then flexible by multilingualism. And then we go on to define the mother tongue based bilingual education uses the child's most familiar language as the language of learning, teaching, and assessment in the foundation phase. That's grade 1, 2, and 3. And then continuing to use the child's mother tongue as the LOLTA while adding another language, in this case English, as a complementary LOLTA in the intermediate phase. And beyond, this means content subjects such as maths, natural science, technology, social sciences taught in more than one language. Now, just to give you so the next two slides that I'm going to show you are actually from Naledi own presentation. So you can see they've got the Department of Basic Education logo on them and so on. So in presenting translanguaging alongside MTBBE, Dr. Bude Mahane talks about normalizing it in pedagogy and multilingual assessment. So accepting what teachers have been doing and supporting what they've been doing in order to offer a gradual release of English as the only LOLT, because it has been, but not really actually. And to really to move towards a bilingual process, building on what is familiar with teachers, let's put it that way. Okay, so that's what it says. That's what she says, on the slide. But it's not necessarily been like that in practice. So also just showing you one of the rollout slides that she has shared. It involves policy, which is implementation of the language and education policy. Note, it's not policy change, it's implementation of what's already existing. teacher training to get teachers ready, resourcing, learning and teaching support materials, advocacy at all layers. So there is full awareness of what is needed to implement and to roll out mother tongue-based bilingual education. It's not that people are not aware of what is needed. But the description in terms of preparing the system in 23, 24, rolling out in 2025 with grade 4, and it's only maths and science, right? It's only 2 subjects. And then continuing each year, taking that up. So this year it's grade 5, maths and science, the following one, and it will go all the way till 2033 when the current grade 5s are in their final year, grade 12 of schooling. So this is not a primary school initiative. The commitment is to take it all the way through to grade 12, and also to expand to the other content subjects. But that hasn't been done yet, mainly because of resource constraints. So on the one hand, we have the translanguaging that I've shared with you. But on the other hand, we have these, what's called the language splits. So this is something that's quite controversial for us, is that they have specified that in the first year, those 2 subjects, maths and science, should use 80% African language and 20% English Afrikaans, and then that increases up till 50-50. But to quantify your time teaching is not very easy, and also what children find easier is not something you can. So what they have then done is that to ensure that there is some implementation of this, the actual curriculum topics. So South Africa has a very prescribed curriculum. It's the same curriculum for everyone in the country, and pretty much they're supposed to be doing the same thing every day at the same time almost. So it's highly prescriptive. And then in the actual topics for the term, you will see that what they have specified is that certain topics should be taught in the African language, and then other topics in the English only, or Afrikaans only. And then you can imagine with the maths that this, you're learning certain concepts in one language, and then you've got to learn another bit of content in another. So the continuity up through the grades is problematic. And so we have, although we haven't written publicly or spoken publicly, when we do our training with teachers, we do not follow this 80-20 split. We encourage teachers to teach bilingually, and obviously using more of the African language when the children, that's what they mostly know for sure, but still not excluding in particular topics. I'm nearly done, Polly. How am I doing for time? Am I over?
Okay. You're almost there.
Okay. So in line with this, we also see that the materials that have been produced from the Department of Basic Education have been monolingual. So they would be translations from an English or Afrikaans text into a monolingual African language. So this is just an example from, you don't need to read the details, just an example from one of the teacher's guides. And then this is an example of an isiZulu worksheet where, interestingly, the cover is still in English, but the rest is all in isiZulu monolingual. My last slide is then the most contentious part where we did try to intervene was that from the first year of implementation, they were having a common assessment of the natural science for grade 4 learners, and that assessment was also going to follow the 80-20% split. And what we managed to get as a concession, we wanted to have the questions in both languages. We didn't manage to get that, but we did manage to get the concession that children were allowed to answer the questions in either language. So even if they read an English question, they could still write in isiZulu or isiXhosa or a mix of the two if they needed to. And so this is where I'm going to hand over to Polly.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So as we see from what Caroline has presented, the assessments are supposed to be highly monolingual, like 80% in isiXhosa and 20% in English. That's what the DBE is saying. But in the Western Cape, the Western Cape Education Department is starting to subvert that idea, not only because they are being difficult as the department, but they are listening from teachers who are saying that, well, not all of us teachers also know isiXhosa. I might be a Sesotho teacher who's teaching in an isiXhosa class, and I'm also learning by having an English, accompanying isiXhosa. So we do need bilingual text instead of having just one monolingual text, because we've never learned this content in our African languages at school. So having English there accompanies us, it's kind of like a gradual taking the teachers by the hand to move from English to use of African languages. But they need both texts sometimes to also just verify if what they know is what it is what they think when they are reading isiXhosa. So then we see curriculum advisors who, I think chief curriculum specialist, who's responsible for science for 187 schools in the Western Cape, doing her best to make the materials that come from the DBE and change them to bilingualism. And also the teachers, remember Caroline spoke about how people have these deeply held beliefs about language. So we come from colonial mentality that says English is superior to African languages. And many of our teachers also hold some of those beliefs. So if they are promised bilingual education, they sort of make that compromise to say, okay, we will accept African languages if we are still allowed to use English. So because the teachers raise these issues in workshops and in training, then to give them monolingual text feels difficult for them. And so they might start being resistant to the implementation. So the WCED then is, has tried very hard to appease the teachers, but also not just to appease them, but to also understand that it is important. If you've promised a bilingual system, then it must be a bilingual system of education in every way, including in materials, instead of just changing them to make them monolingual materials. So the annual teaching plans, we see them being translated into African languages, but also the assessments that came out as like the exemplars, because exemplars were given to schools on how to prepare the students, the learners for taking these national examinations at the end of grade 4. So we saw from the exemplars that were being passed on to the schools from the Western Cape that the Western Cape was starting to make them bilingual instead of monolingual papers. But also the teachers had complained greatly because in grade 4, when they started implementing, they were not yet trained. Their training only began in November 2025, at the end of the year, after they had a go at implementation. So it wasn't fair. And at the time, some of the teachers were still resistant to implementing. So they may have carried on teaching in English. So this is why it was important for the WCED to version the paper from a monolingual paper to a bilingual paper. Okay. So this brings us back now to the splits, because the papers, the assessments are also supposed to be split into two, like 80% assessment in an African language and 20% English. And so why must there be these percentage splits in MTBBE? The reason for that is that from the research that was conducted before, we have learned, for example, Caroline and Robin Tyler have written an article for a special issue in Reading and Writing, where they traced how in the schools where we were doing some of the research, especially on e-science year to our science, when teachers were provided with materials like the English materials on the left, the bilingual material in the middle, and the isiXhosa material on the right, the teachers preferred the English material to give to the learners. And when they had to make the second choice, they then preferred the middle book, which is the bilingual book, because they thought it was for slow learners. So you can see that there are these deeply held beliefs that then isiXhosa is not chosen in written form. And teachers are used to using isiXhosa for translanguaging orally, but they were kind of resistant. This is what we call this text frontier, being resistant to African languages. For example, an interview that was conducted with teachers about these books and their choices that the choices that they had made, Mr. Kwezi said, and then there are those that are still struggling. Maybe I can try to use that one, is science year too. And Mr. Mohau says, I can use this one as a low level, again, referring to science year to the bilingual material. And then Ms. Azania says, slow learners is science year too. Is good for intervention, is science year too. So it is not seen as like something that is legitimate to do, to give children these bilingual texts, but science, the one that has a bit of African languages, must be used for intervention for slow learners. So this is the reason why then we can understand the language split from the Department of Basic Education, is that teachers are not comfortable. In fact, they are resistant to choosing texts that are in African languages. And of course, we are not surprised because this is the manifestation of coloniality, or in the minds of the colonized. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this again brings us to something else, not just the coloniality of it, but also the conceptualization of language in people's minds, in that we are seeing this tension between fixity and fluidity of languaging. So even in the choice of an English book, that people are fixated to that one language textbook, and then sometimes, yes, we might through the e-science year to language bilingually, so there's always that tension. But we argue that both are needed to resist coloniality of language and to recognize South Africans' languaging practices. And I think it's very important to emphasize African languages in institutions, as schools are institutions, for example, that have denied the use of African languages and erased them, for schooling. So we have to name the languages and bring them on as the named languages. But also, we can't just be fixated on the named languages, but also bring the languaging that happens, as we know, multilinguals language using their rich linguistic repertoires. So Ngugi's arguments of cultural alienation and the need to write and make knowledge in African languages is very important, and this is the strategic essentialism that Gayatri and Spivak and Fass write about, the strategic essentialism, where you want to focus on the African languages. But fluidity, it brings us back to the work of McKinney and Penny Cook, who argue about disinventing African languages because these autonomous languages were colonial scripts and written in ways that try and make us to be fixated in one language, ignoring the languaging practices of multilingual people. So we say, therefore, both of these can fit within the epistemology of decoloniality. And sorry, Caroline is helping me move because the computer is not mine, so I'm not so used to it. So in this sense, moving from there, because we argue for both of these things to happen, I want now to move us to our work within the Bualit and what we have been doing before the implementation of MTBBE. We have been working with schools to promote, like in small scale pilots that we've had in small scale pilots that we've been having. Those helped us. Especially in arguing for MTBBE at the DBE or for bilingual education. We've been working with teachers talking about bilingual education rather than mother tongue based bilingual education, because we've had this we have read our context as a context that wants both of these languages, and then also read that the people become resistant when you mention mother tongue, because of the apartheid, experience of linking mother tongues with what we call the inferior Bantu education curriculum. So, and we know that they compromise when you then bring both of languages. I often talk of best of both languages. So when you give them best of both, we have a kind of bread we call best of both in South Africa. So best of both languages is better than having one. So we've been creating science materials for schools, and we have on the right is Science Year to our science booklet that we wrote on living and non-living things, together with the colleagues that we mentioned earlier in the Bualit, and then support from other colleagues here at our school's development unit at UCT, as well as Pumle, who did the illustrations, the artist. And we tried to experiment with the different forms of bilingual education in this booklet. So it's not one way. For example, the one on the far right in isiXhosa and English is actually, in some pages it changes. Sometimes you have paragraph in one language, sometimes you have a fixed paragraph in, you can go to this. So as you can see there, just with the teacher talking, we were trying to imagine how a teacher begins a lesson in class, and they would write on the board, they would write something like, living and living things, and then turn to the children and ask, what are we talking about when we talk about living and non-living things? So the teacher there says, sithetha ngantoni xa sisithi living and non-living things. And I'm just going to read just one sentence here, where it says, igama living things libhekisa kwizinto eziphilayo okanye ezazike zaphila, while igama elithi non-living things libhekisa kwizinto ezingaphiliyo nezingazanga zaphila. In English, living things are things that live. In order for things to live, they have to do 7 things. So we tried to be fluid with this text, and then we show glossaries where we show the children the meanings of words in one language or another. And if you look on your right, you can see the first paragraph is mainly in isiXhosa, while the second paragraph is in English. So we were experimenting with this one, and when we then wrote the also science one in isiXhosa, in caps and English, we experimented with the separation of the languages so that people can see how bilingualism can also present itself in this way. So we talk of many multilingualism as not only one thing, basically. And so with the children that we were working with in the classrooms, when they have to write the notes in their books, so this is an example of how their notes looked like, being bilingual notes in the book. And so our experience with this was informing what we were arguing for when we were supporting MTBBE implementation at the DBE level. And so back to assessments. So an assessment was conducted, for example, with the learners who were using e-science to material in the school, and together with a control class that didn't have the intervention, but they were given the booklet. So they had the booklet, the children to read the booklet, but the teachers were still, teaching in English and assessing in English in the control class. And then in the research class, the children could write in 2 languages in their assessment. In fact, the assessment came in English. And this is what we see when the children were writing in English only. What they write on the page doesn't seem so legible and easy to understand because children are in grade 4 and they might still be struggling with expressing themselves in English, and also they are still learning to be literate in the language. But when the test was taken by the class that was the research in the research study, the test was bilingual and the children could answer in any language they choose. And we see here that even though the paper was bilingual, the children could answer in isiXhosa. So we can see this child answered in isiXhosa and also reasoned, wrote a longer sentence that was meaningful in terms of how they answered the question. So now I'm going to move to the next one. Almost we're getting to the end. The slide on the resource constraints. So what we are saying, while MTBBE is exciting for us, while the implementation of MTBBE is exciting for us, it has brought a new dawn, in our education system. But there is no specific funding that is given for MTBBE at national and provincial levels. So everything had to be implemented all at once. For example, getting the teachers to teach before they got to be trained. Materials are being developed at the same time. They were not developed earlier than, they are developed at the same time as the implementation has to start. So we see this hasty production of learning materials and teacher guide in African languages, and they are being posted online at the DBE website, or even shared as PDF documents for teachers. So it's still difficult to get money to print these materials for the classrooms. We have these unresolved debates on translation, where people start to see the translation, especially with the transliterated terms. So people being angry about that, saying this is not isiXhosa. So, but I think we are getting there with the training, but it still doesn't end. Not everybody is convinced that this is the way to go, but the teachers are doing something regardless. There are no funds for printing materials, just for maths and science, for example, and we are not talking about the whole curriculum, of the school, and there is no commissioning of new textbooks. So it is still a challenge for schools. There's limited teacher trainings. We've had in the Western Cape 3 trainings of teachers, 1 in November and 2 in March. And in those we had 2-day training for the teachers, and that's it. And that also means that we said about we trained about 187. There are 187 schools. So if we were to multiply that by, say, taking 2 teachers per school, it would be like 300 and something. And so it means that we haven't even reached that amount of teachers in terms of training. Training has been happening also in the Eastern Cape province, but we are not sure if the training has happened across the country in other provinces. So we are not yet sure. This has to be researched. So what Bualit also has done was to then support the DBE by developing an introduction to mother tongue-based bilingual education online course, where we were envisioning teachers across the country taking that 2 to 3 hour course and doing it instead of having nothing. And we've had about 3,154 people who have completed the course thus far. And and we developed also like public education materials, like Caroline has said, as in the form of these pamphlets, which you can find on Boalit if you go to the website. But now coming to the end, I have this 2 minutes video to share, hearing the voices from the learners, because it's well and easy to just talk from as adults, but we also want to hear more from the children and to hear what they think of this. Okay.
Kukho abantwana who struggle ufunda ngeXhosa, then kubekho aba-struggle ufunda nge-English. But to me, I would think it's important to learn both languages.
Xa sifunda sithatha amagama from English so asesiXhosa, then sibhale iposter, then sipresente efront, then sibhale uba sifunde ntoni ngaloo magama.
Ii-materials zakwazana zisinceda kakhulu, especially dictionaries, because akhona amanye amagama kwi-English esinicinga uba anzima kakhulu, but xa si-translate to isiXhosa siyabona okay la magama lilula ligama, but i-English le isibhida kakhulu.
Into endingayi-advise uba bengenziwa kwezinye izikolo uba like abantu baka-basic education ba-produce more dictionaries, benzela uba zonke izikolo benazi-dictionaries zesiXhosa neze-English.
Asikho bade kakhulu kwi-English, so isiXhosa siyasazi, sisithetha emakhaya esitratweni, and ilanguage esiyisebenzisa 100% xa sisemakhaya. So ke ngoku iyasinceda ke ngoku ukuba xa sisebenzisa zombini iyasibhalansisa, asithi uba sizoyiyeka i-English yaqha senze ibhalansi.
Okay, xa sifunda ngamalwimi amabini ngeelanguage eziyi-2, we are finding new ways to learn and we find it easy to learn.
If kukhona igama le-English, obviously ikhona nelesiXhosa.
Kwi-maths nesayensi nyani bekuthiwa uba bakhona amagama afike ephumbe estik enzima nyani, but if wayicaciselwa ngesiXhosa soze ungayibambe.
Asikwazi ukufunda nge-English, English iyasixakamisa.
Abanye abantu bafeyiswa yile nto uba bengayi-understanding question because of ibhalwe nge-English.
Abanye abantwana baye bacinga ubana zizilolena, kanti abazazilolena baxakwa yi-English.
I-English nayo ibalulekile, funeka sikwazi ucommunicate nabanye abantu abengabaXhosa, but ayikhombi into yoba isiXhosa sisifunda because isiXhosa ekugqibeleni ilanguage yethu, and ke xa sizojonga ilanguage yethu phantsi irongo loo nto.
Yeah, so the learners who are talking at the end are learners that we were working with in another project called Languaging for Learning project in high school from 2023 to 2022 to 2024. And we were working in grade 8 and 9 classrooms and supporting teachers to teach bilingually and doing coaching and development for teachers in terms of training workshops and coaching them in the classroom while also researching the work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And you got me crying with the video. So that was good because it's very emotional, right? And it's clearly emotional for the young people that were talking. I think that's a really good way to, the kids get it.
Mm.
So the rest of us have to get it somehow. Thank you so much. We could include, we don't have a big group today online at this time, but we welcome questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please, you can raise your hand virtually or let us know in the chat and we'll call on you. I wonder if I could just say a couple of things that you made me think of because I'm really interested. Yeah, and maybe you can respond more to this. I'm very interested in it seems there are compromises always between the scholarly discourse, like what are we saying, what terms do we use, how do we think of languages, and then the how we have to work with education offices and families and schools to help them understand. So it seems that we can't always we can't, for example, go right with McKinney and Pennycook and say there's no boundaries between languages because that doesn't work in the schools, and that's a problem that I have with the scholarly discourse, that it doesn't always have practical implications, and it could make people more confused. Yeah, I just wonder if you want to say any more about that. Also, the terminology, I think, is really, you explained very well the context of South Africa and why the terminology that you're using is more appropriate for that context.
I, I think I'll start saying one thing, Carol, and I think that what's a strength for us is that we're working between the scholar position and the practitioner and activist position. And I
Yeah.
think for quite a long time, I felt apologetic about that, that we weren't doing proper research and so on. And now I actually have rejected that feeling
Good.
whatsoever. I don't care if people, that's what they say, well, then fine. But what it does mean is it enables us to say, well, we know this works because we've done it and we've worked with teachers and they've shown us. And so moving between those two, we try to theorize what we are doing in the classroom and also to go the other way, as well, to see how can what we're theorizing make sense.
Yes, I think for us, you are right with these compromises. We have to be aware of where we've come from. Like I mentioned earlier, we've come
Mm.
from apartheid where the two things were coupled. Language was coupled with the inferior curriculum. So we can understand
Yeah.
why people are saying no to mother tongue. But if you are promising them that they will have best of both, then they also compromise on the other side. So now the compromises are also even between us as people who have worked on the ground, like Caroline is saying, and those who haven't and who are writing but are also not educationists, because
Yeah.
there's a difference also between, I think, the applied linguists or educational linguists and those who are working maybe from social linguistics, is that in education you have to teach, you have to name things, you have to mention things, and so that makes it a bit. I think on
Yeah.
our side, it makes us to think about the explicit messages we are passing on into the system.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another thing that really resonates with me is the resistance by people, the challenges that are presented when not all of the implementers share languages with the learners, and
Mm,
yeah, resistance in one way, but then that kind of resistance, like if people aren't proficient in learners' languages, how are they perceiving this kind of change in the education system? But I wanted to share one of the things that we discovered in Cambodia, which is a much smaller program using indigenous languages in schools, and adding Khmer, the national language. One thing we found is that we now have, they've been doing it long enough so that the kids that went through a bilingual system, when the teachers, even speakers of the language, were having trouble using that language in school, but those kids have now gone through the program, even gone through teacher education only in the dominant language, but they still know their own languages, and
mm,
they're not having trouble anything like what that initial group, if you can
mm,
call them cohorts, the newer
Yeah.
cohorts, They're quite comfortable. So I really respect what Naledi is trying to do, like talking about smoothing the transition of or the changes. But I think that a lot of these issues can be resolved in a generation of teachers.
Yes, yes. And also we see that the teachers are also willing to learn, but the compromise that needs to be made from now the DBE perspective, from the DBE side, is the
Yeah,
compromise to make everything bilingual. The teachers are saying we are willing to learn, but bring the English, because not all of us learned through English in school, and I mean through the mother tongue in
through there.
school. So we might not know what some of the things are, but if you give us bilingual, stuff, we're going to maybe make transfers, knowledge transfers from one language to another, but make us understand by bringing both texts.
Yeah. It's very exciting what you're doing with like different kinds of texts, separating the languages or integrating them. I think it's very exciting. I look forward to hearing more about that. Do you want to say any more? What were the different kinds? Okay, separation, but were they side by side texts or
Yes.
separation on the same pages or?
Yes, sometimes you'll find a much more monolingual page, but in another page you might find two languages, in the same page
Yeah,
separately, or find them meshed together. So we see that sometimes send like a paragraph, or we'll start with one or two lines in another language and continue in another language for another two lines. So we've also done something like that from the
very.
experiment.
But the interesting thing with the material, because it was a Boerlit project, not government, so we had the freedom to do exactly what we wanted to. But interestingly, with the grade 6 materials that you saw the cover of, which is CAPS and English, first materials in CAPS, that they've decided to do parallel bilingualism so that the texts are either in CAPS or in English. And the reason is because of government not wanting to use materials where it's seen as too transgressive. So I think we're still talking about whether we'll do another version of Isaiah and maybe keep the speech bubbles of the teacher still translingual, because really that is very much natural in terms of, and you're saying it's oral, but then the other texts to maybe separate them, out more so that they're more acceptable to the government officials, to actually use them.
I would say maybe, I mean, we thought about versioning that into like more like the CAPS and English, but I would say let's not do it, because in another project we are working with Room to Read, where Nadima is, and we are producing books, bilingual books for science, using the curriculum. So last year we produced 5 books. There were 5 authors, and we produced, in fact, there were 4 authors. I produced 2, one on the sun and stars, and then another one on the solar system. And this year I've written one on the moon. So they come bilingually, and they are more separated, the languages. And I think in this year's group, there is someone writing about living and non-living things.
Okay.
So it might come out as a separate one, and then we can still have this one as a mixed, fluid one. So that work is going on as well as we are talking. It's not from the government side, but it's an NGO, Room to Read.
Yes.
And because we are writing these in isiXhosa English, Sotho English, Zulu English, we are supposed to, and I think we have Sepedi English, and then there's one in English, an English author who's Indian, writes in English, and I think she chooses which language it can be translated to. So all of these are going to be versioned in all languages. so that
And
they
that's
are available in all. So they want 10 titles. We produced 5 last year. They want another 5 this year, and then 10 titles times 9 languages, accompanied by English. That's what's going to happen. So I hope that the DBE could take some of those materials and really print from them to give to the teachers.
it's brilliant to have them be consistent with cups. I think that's really, really smart. Could you, I want to open up the discussion. I bet Kelsey has questions too, but I wonder if you could just talk about the funding issues, because you said there's not any funding attached to these kinds of initiatives from the government side or from the provincial side. So, and Boalit is an NGO, I guess, like Room to Read. Yeah. So could you talk about how you're managing the funding issues?
Okay, so I think, well, Boalit is so it's not an NGO. We're an NPO, which means that we can take donations and but we don't pay salaries or any of. So we do our work voluntarily through that kind of gifts of time. And we've
Yeah.
raised little bits of funding for different projects. So, like the Science Year 2, there was some Belgium funding that we managed to get for that. We've also, with the languaging,
For learning.
no, what's the other thing we've done? I can't
Science
remember.
Year.
Oh, no. Yeah, we also ran workshops in schools that are private or that are wealthy, enabling them to change their language policies and introduce African languages, because although those schools are wealthy, they are mixed racially and linguistically, and we charge them for workshops, and then we use that money to do other kinds of projects. So it's sort of on a shoestring.
I see.
But
Yeah.
on the
department
yeah,
side,
the WCED, they have actually
a
paid
project.
for some of the printing of
Okay.
materials, and
Good.
they've also it's one of their subject specialists that has been facilitating the translation so that there's bilingual. So they have covered. I don't know the cost or whether she's just doing it. Sometimes she's calling Polly to do stuff.
Yeah, the science person doesn't have any funding, whereas the maths, I think, has, because of the Back on Track project. Back on Track is a project that was conceptualized after COVID-19, because there was disruption in learning. So they were trying to put teachers and
Right.
learners back on track. So by retraining them and also introducing new ways of working with the new ATP's annual teaching plans, and also workshopping them. So I think there's money in that project or on Back on Track, which has allowed for the maths to be printed and not the science, for
Good.
example. But it could have been that one term got printed, but not all of the materials for all of the terms has been printed. It's quite an expensive project, according to Andre from the department. And from Naledi's side, there isn't supposed to be funding, a separate funding for MTBBE, because the expectation is that those textbooks that were produced in English are now should now be replaced by the ones that have been prepared for MTBBE. So it's now the fight, I guess, or the challenge is with working with the departments to repurpose the money for printing the English textbooks and print these ones that are new. But we don't know yet that if all the departments are seeing eye to eye with that idea. But this is an idea. MTBBE has been now taken up really seriously and has been mentioned even in the SONA, which is the
State of the
Nation
President's
address, has been mentioned, and
twice now, hey?
twice last year and this year, and also the Minister of Education has put it up as one of her projects that she's working on.
Wow. Thank you so much for these. It's so interesting to see how things are moving forward. And I hear from Kelsey that we have some questions in the chat that I didn't see. So
Yes.
could you help us?
Absolutely. We have a few. We'll start with Matthews. Matthews asks, was the argument or plea for translanguaging during teaching and learning accompanied by translanguaging of assessments as well?
Yes, it was.
Yes, that's the argument. So, for example, we used to talk of LOLT, which is language of teaching and learning, sort of learning and teaching, but now it has become LOLTA, language of learning, teaching, and assessment, and that the circular does say that there must be an alignment between languages of assessment and languages of teaching. So, language of assessment should match languages of teaching. Basically, that's what it said, and that's why then but of course the contradiction is with the split. So if the teachers in oral translanguaging, they are using both of the languages and not splitting them in the 80-20%, then why would then the assessment have an 80-20? So I think that's where the issue is. And somebody asked about the material, whether they are open source. Yes, the materials are on some of.
I put the answer in, yeah.
Oh, you answered. Yes, they are in Boalit. So Caroline has answered in the chat.
And
We
then
have another question. Did you see Samkelo's question? In practice, does this percentage model or the language split trench the very hierarchies MTBBE is meant to dismantle by implying that one language still needs to be dominant? And what would a repertoire-based alternative to percentage allocation look like in policy terms? I don't know if you saw that question.
One beautiful question. It sounds like one of your students, maybe. Great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that Samkelo is right, is that when you put percentages, and regardless even of dominance or equal, you are saying that languages can be bounded, they can be clearly separated. And when we say a word like, photosynthesis, now how are we going to say, is that English, is that isiXhosa, if we use the phonological features of one language but the lexical of another, so it's I mean, it is very, very difficult. It does it does entrench a false view of language. And I think that the repertoire based, it's important, but we have to also make distinctions between when are we wanting people to behave like monolinguals using standard languages, and when are we allowing people to be as they really, are. So everybody, when they're coming into school, does have to learn the languages of assessment and so on, but that doesn't mean they should be policed to have to do everything in that way. So our feeling is that some assessments, kids can use languages freely as they would want. Others, we would ask them, okay, can you write this in monolingual isiXhosa or in monolingual, English? And that's the way that we would see it. But for us, certainly from grade 4, and while the kids are still young, they should be getting assessments which have got the questions in both languages, and they should be allowed to answer in the languages that they're comfortable, including a mix, because the focus should be not on the language purity, but on whether they've understood the concepts. This isn't their English class or their isiXhosa class. This is science and maths.
Exactly. That is a point that it seems obvious to education professionals, but teachers have been for years correcting language rather than content on content assessments. So I think that's a super important point that needs to be made again with teachers.
And because we also have school-based assessments and then the national assessment, so we could use the school-based assessments to prepare learners that sometimes they might be asked to answer in another language or in another language. So we could be training them in flexible ways. That also there's no reason why we can't in school have sections to say answer section A in isiXhosa, section B in English, and this one section C bilingually as part of that kind of training. And once the learners are trained, then they can expect that in the national assessment.
Yeah, then it's tied to the standards, right? Or what we want the learners to be able to do at a certain point. And it means also that teachers know that the students will need the terms and the ability to put their thoughts together in a certain language for that standard.
Yes.
But I mean, even at the moment, although a lot of people don't know it and it's not applied equally or equitably, in the final grade 12 national assessment, standardized assessment, when students are writing in content subjects, they are not supposed to be penalized for, incorrect use of language. And in fact, if they do use African languages in their writing, as long as the content is correct, they are supposed to be credited. And I was really surprised when the Sue-Ann Rampo, who's the curriculum advisor that we've been working with in the Western Cape, when she explained that to me, because that's not, I think, what happens in practice. I think what happens is that if you're at an exam center where the examiners happen to be proficient in the languages which some kids might have introduced into their writing, you'll get credit for it. But if they are, it's not set up in a it's luck, and if you have somebody who doesn't recognize, then you won't get those points,
It is changing because I remember when we met for teaching practice, we met mentor teachers from schools who are mentoring our PGCE students. One of the teachers came to me and said she's an examiner and that they are making those changes and they are being told now not to penalize learners if they use a Xhosa word to instead of English.
So they're aware.
They are becoming aware.
Poco a poco, as we say. I wonder about the other provinces now, because of course your work has been focused in the Western Cape, but do you want to say anything about the other provinces? And it sounds like your wonderful training for, what was it, 1,000 something
3,000
teachers? 2,000. That's just 3,000. Sorry. Oh, yes, I have 3,154.
3,100. Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear about that. And I wonder what you can say about the rest of the country.
Like I said earlier, the Eastern Cape has been doing some preparation for MTBBE, with Zola being there and Brian Ramadiro and Xolisa, Xolisa Chongolo.
Yes.
Yes, all three of them have been working together in the past few years, preparing the teachers for implementation of MTBBE. So, but we don't know the extent to which they've done the training, and but we do know that it's been ongoing. I think 2024 already they were doing some work there, and then in Western Cape it was, apart from the small pilots that we had been working with, we then now trained these 80 teachers in November, and then 60 and 90 teachers in March in the Western Cape. In terms of other provinces, when we looked at the website, we tried to see which teachers have done the course the most. We saw Northwest Province was the province where the majority of the people have done the course. And the course is the reason why I'm saying the people, because it's not just the teachers. It could be curriculum advisors or parents or anybody who's interested in this field. So, and also we're trying to assist principals and curriculum advisors. So they had a larger number of people who had done the course, followed by Gauteng. where Johannesburg and Pretoria are. And then there were very few people who had done the course from our province and the Eastern Cape. It was like 5% Cape Town, 5% the Eastern Cape, whereas there were like 20-something percent in Northwest and 19% or 17% from Gauteng. It's also been done internationally, so we get to see some international people doing it, but also we see that organizations that are interested in education and are working with teachers, we see them like in Johannesburg, where they are mediating the course, the online course, with teachers in some or practitioners in some centers where they are doing the training. So everybody will be doing the course online, but then they stop and have a discussion. And so that's what has been happening. For example, with PrimTED having done this, and then also the Literacy Association of South Africa has also done some of that work with other teachers. So we really appreciate where people are also showing initiative to say some people might struggle to conceptualize alone, in front of the computer. It might be helpful to have a group and dialogue about the course with others. So that has happened as well. And currently, I can see through the messages that come through our email, even though I'm not answering the emails, we do receive. And so when they appear on my phone, I'm like, oh, there's a message. I just quickly glance and I see people are doing their course or they are being stuck. And for those who's a PhD student of Robin at UCC is managing the back end of our website, and so she responds to the people who struggle with the course or when there's a glitch on the website, and assists the people doing the course. And I keep seeing even academics that are doing the course. I've seen them and I'm like, oh, so-and-so is doing the course. Nice.
But can any of us take it?
Yes, you can take it. You can take it.
Do you want to put the link, or is it on Wallet's
website? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You'll see. You can take it. It's a 2 to 3 hour course. We do give people up to 4 weeks to complete the course if they are too busy. But if you take a Saturday off, you can do it in 3 hours.
Yeah, you can just do it.
And then just do it at once. And you get a certificate at the end of the course. And by the way, some of our PGCE students, even though they are high school students, they also do it as part of their assessment.
Yeah, so in our teacher education course here, I teach a language and literacy across the curriculum, and those students, they have to do the course as part of their assessment. So that's also,
wonderful,
a way of building it into the training, because teacher training is a massive gap in this area. We didn't even talk about the pre-service, but it's a huge gap.
Yeah. Let's hold that. I see that we're running to the end of our time, but I love that point about pre-service training, and I think that's an area that we could discuss in another webinar. Maybe we should pull some people together who are working in that area and really delve into what's happening in different places. So thank you so much. Kelsey, are we okay did we get all the questions? Yeah. Okay, good.
I think so.
Okay. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry, but we're just to the end of our time. So thank you so much, Guzula and Carolyn, for your presentation today and the wonderful discussion. Thanks to everyone who participated actively in the discussion, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much, Carol.
Thank you.
Really feel honored to have been asked to do this webinar for you. And also, I'm glad that you've also met my colleague here, as our students.
By the names of the people who are still working in this area actively, I see that all of us who were mentored by Neville Alexander are really, he would be so proud of everyone and what everyone's doing, if not mentored by him, at least inspired by all of the things that he he was talking about so many years ago. So thank you for that also. It's very empowering for a lot of us.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you
take
so
care.
much.
Thank you very
Take care.
much. All the
Bye-bye.
best. Bye-bye.